The Stilled Patter by James E. Gunn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dale Grothmann. The age-old battle of the sexes may yet be the deadliest of all. The Stilled Patter by James E. Gunn. George Washington was the father of his country. I'm not George Washington. My name is Andrew Jones, and it is because of me there will be no more Joneses in the world. There will be, in fact, no more anybody. This is the end of the world. It did not come through fire or ice, with a bang or a whimper, from solar catastrophe or man's suicidal misuse of atomic power, or any of the other fearful possibilities with which the Sunday supplement writers once terrified us. It came through the exposure of an age-old conspiracy. I did it. My excuse is the eternal excuse of scientists. I sought the truth. How it was used was not my concern, but that it should have led to the depopulation of the earth concerns me, as it must concern every man, and I have an unshakable feeling of guilt. Perhaps I write this now in the hope that I may someday purge myself. I know that it will never be read. The linen wick gutters in the saucer of melted tallow. It casts strange shadows on the cellar wall. Sometimes I think that they are ghosts of children come to haunt me, the ghosts of all the little children who will never be born. But this is not what I sat down to write while I waited for Lindsay to return. What is keeping Lindsay? He should be back by now. I will begin again. My name is Andrew Jones, and today, by my figures, is October 3rd, 1969. The weather is turning cold here, and soon we must go look for another hiding place. My joints are getting old. The damp has seeped into them. I long for the year-long warmth of California or Florida, but those areas are still crowded and deadly. Someone would recognize me. I think we will try a powerhouse again this winter. Often they have supplies of coal large enough to last us through the cold weather without extra foraging. Cataclysm began in 1954, June 13th to be exact. That was the day my second child was born, a boy we named Kevin. It is surprising that a man who was the father of two children should accuse himself of depopulating the earth. And yet it is because I was the father of two children that it happened. Prenatal care of mothers and postnatal care of infants were the subject of compelling interest in those days, arriving monthly in the burgeoning women's magazines, and annually in the proliferous child care manuals. Pediatricians and mothers besieged parents with advice, and we consumed everything with Catholic appetite. Logical, illogical, sensible, insensible, nonsensical, self-contradictory. They kept us on our toes, strung as taut as Stradivarius violins, afraid to act for fear we would do the wrong thing, afraid not to act for fear inaction would be disastrous. Pediatricians and mothers, always the same authors. Never were there any articles on the care of mother and child by a father, only by what I came to think of as the vested interests. I was slow, I admit, but what father has not been slow? Who, if he had not been slow, would be a father? Books and articles would have been troublesome enough if the information they imparted had been accurate, but slowly I became aware that they were often subtly interwoven with misstatements. I raveled them out. I categorized them. I counted 5 different kinds before I convinced myself. A mother published this: 1 baby takes up all your time. 2 can't take any more. The fallacy is obvious. A certain amount of housework is inescapable. If a mother was unable to do the work, what happened to it? Answer: somebody else did it. Who? Even in the abundance of those days, most of us couldn't afford nurses, maids, cooks, laundresses, or cleaning women. The era of the poor relation who came to help out for a few months was long past. Who did the work then? The father, that's who. I stared deep into the shocking chasm between the mental processes of men and women. I studied the statement again. There was no misstatement at all, if you granted the hidden premise and didn't boggle on the implications. It was perfectly valid. The hidden premise was that women did all the housework, but that hadn't been true for a generation. The husband-father had been drafted into home service, and there was no discharge for him short of death or total disability. The latter was hard to prove. But the implication was a deadly thing. In the consideration of second child, a father's time and labor counted for nothing. I remember a shaggy little story about a farmer who held up his hog and let it eat the corn off the stalk. "Doesn't it take a long time to fatten up a hog that way?" exclaimed the efficiency expert. "Sure," said the farmer, "but what's time to a hog?" And what, in a woman's eyes, was time to a father? The second type of misstatement was pure omission. The thing the baby books didn't mention was that most women felt 10 times worse during their second pregnancy. At this time in life became most unbearable for them, and it was, as a consequence, completely unbearable for their husbands. Not one baby book or article mentioned that fact. That it was a fact I proved by a personal survey. Every mother I questioned revealed that she felt horrible during her second pregnancy. She was surprised that my wife and I didn't know this. I was not surprised. Nobody ever mentioned it. That is why we didn't know. I think it was at this time I first asked myself, is there a subconscious conspiracy to keep this kind of information from leaking out? It wasn't important that women didn't know this. They had selective memories. Proof of this was that mankind lasted as long as it did. If they were maternally inclined, as most of them were at one time or another, the disadvantages of pregnancy faded into a sort of merciful blur. If there was a conspiracy, it was aimed at fathers. It was intended to lull them into the logical supposition that conditions usually improve, and that experience is the great teacher. Pure delusion. With women, things are always worse, and they are born with all the knowledge they will ever need. Babies could be divided into 2 kinds, most and occasional. Consider, for instance, the following quotation. Most babies in the early months sleep from feeding to feeding. An occasional baby won't fall into this pattern, but insists on being sociable after his meals. The first time I read that, I supposed that this business of most and occasional was a statistical matter. That was my fatal mistake. If there is any statistical backing to that statement, I never found it. In my experience, the chances are 9 out of 10 that, try as you would have an occasional baby. We did. We had 2 of them. The fourth type of misstatement was the false generalization. It was said, much too often, a full baby is a sleepy baby. That is a restatement of the quotation above. I sat down with a pencil and paper and figured it out. A small infant took half an hour to finish a bottle. If he ate 5 times a day, he would spend 21.5 hours asleep out of every 24. A little further on, I would read something like, if a baby wakes up early, he is not getting enough to eat. I drew up a schedule. Baby wakes up being hungry. Baby gets fed, all he can hold. Baby is sleepy, being fed. Baby goes to sleep, being sleepy. Baby sleeps until next feeding, being full. I didn't recognize the baby. Who could? He wasn't my child or anyone else's. He was a pediatrician's pipe dream child. I looked at it another way. If the baby slept except when being fed, when did it get the baths, orange juice, vitamins, cereal, and everything else the pediatricians prescribed? Hoist by their own petards. The fifth type of misstatement is the impossible ideal. I tried this one for logic. Baby should not be allowed to cry before feeding. Had those doctors ever tried to keep a hungry child from crying? Hungry children cry. It is their nature. Some of them, my kind for instance, cry very hard. And children, even pipe dream children, woke up hungry. Warming a bottle to a drinkable temperature took time, at least 5 minutes, and sometimes 10. Meanwhile, in spite of everything that everyone could do, the baby was crying. He would not be cajoled, walked, teased, pattered, jollied, scolded, or argued into accepting any substitute for his formula. With him, it was food or nothing. For horror, I had a favorite scene. A mother alone rushes from baby to bottle, from bottle to baby, one screaming, the other cold, frantic with the pediatrician's admonitions, and then both too hot. I would not have had it on my conscience for all the royalties in America. At least, I have saved the world that. There are more misstatements, but those were enough. I did what any man, any scientist, would have done. I gave my findings to the world. They were published under the title, What the Baby Books Won't Tell You. The article stirred up immediate controversy. It was not enough to uncover a conspiracy. You must find a motive. I had discovered the motive behind the great conspiracy. Baby books were not written to teach parents how to care for their children. Baby books were written to sell baby books. The magazines published articles about babies to sell magazines to mothers. Valid reasons. If they had not existed, there would have been no baby books, no women's magazines. But this had far-reaching consequences. The market for baby books and women's magazines was the great proliferating population of new parents. If the awful truth about parenthood were published, if these hardy, ingenious souls were discouraged, something quite startling would happen to the market. It would disappear. There were attempts at suppression on all levels, but the truth was out and nothing could stop its spread. Secret printing presses turned out reprints by the millions. They were passed from hand to hand. Fathers whispered the word to husbands. Husbands passed it on to bachelor friends. The word raced around the world. It would not have been so disastrous if Lindsay McPherson had not simultaneously perfected his contraceptive pill out of a Southwest plant named Lithospermum rudimale. For the first time, a contraceptive was safe, cheap, and convenient, and 100% effective in reducing male fertility. Birth control was in the hands of men. Billions of the tiny pills were turned out. Enemy nations sowed them over each other's territory in boxes containing translations of my article. Men cached them away, carried them in money belts, hollowed out hiding places in the heels of shoes. Births dropped suddenly. Almost overnight, the maternity wards were depopulated. Hospitals went broke or began advertising for patrons, sick or well. The makers of baby food, baby apparel, and baby accessories went next. Then the women's magazines when they lost their advertising. In a few years, the condition hit the schools. One by one, they closed their doors. It was a creeping paralysis. Toy makers and sellers collapsed. The clothing industry couldn't survive long. The shoemakers were the hardest hit. Food consumption dropped. All over the country, farmers went broke. By comparison, the Great Depression seemed like a boom. By 1965, the end was in sight. Society disintegrated. The cities were deserted. They burned for years. From a mechanical, agricultural civilization, the world returned to the Stone Age in 1 decade. People went in packs for protection. There were 2 kinds of them: packs of men hunting for food, and packs of women hunting for men. Soon, as women grow too old for childbearing, the race of man will be doomed. I did it. I am guilty. Lindsay helped, but I am the one. But how was I to know that society, that human life itself, was founded on a basic deception? I wonder what is keeping Lindsay. He should be back by now. Editor's note: this manuscript was found in a cellar of a house in a Midwestern city. It is presented here partly for its historical interest, but chiefly for your amusement. Mr. Wilma Masters, the former Andrew Jones, was found in the same cellar. Our hunting party had taken Lindsay McPherson some time before, and he had directed us promptly to the cellar. Men are like that. As is the custom, the man was stripped, carefully searched, and sent to the premarital barracks to wait for some girl's proposal. Our readers will be happy to learn they are both back in service. Never underestimate the power of a woman. Wilma Masters. The end of The Stilled Pattern by James E. Gunn.
Tea Tray in the Sky by Evelyn E. Smith. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Visiting a society is tougher than being born into it. A 40-credit-hour tour is no substitute. The picture changed on the illuminated panel that filled the forward end of the shelf on which Michael lay. A haggard, blonde woman sprawled apathetically in a chair. "Run down, nervous, hypertensive?" inquired a mellifluous voice. "In need of mental therapy? Buy Girgis juice. It's not expensive, and they swear by it on MeroPay." A disembodied pair of hands administered a spoonful of Girgis juice to the woman, whereupon her hair turned bright yellow, makeup bloomed on her face, her clothes grew briefer, and she burst into a fast Callistan clog. "I see from your hair that you've been a member of one of the Brotherhoods," the passenger lying next to Michael on the shelf remarked inquisitively. He was a middle-aged man, his dust-brown hair thinning on top, his small blue eyes glittering preternaturally from the lenses fitted over his eyeballs. Michael rubbed his fingers ruefully over the blonde stubble on his scalp and wished he had waited until his tonsure were fully grown before he had ventured out into the world. But he had been so impatient to leave the lodge, so impatient to exchange the flowing robes of the Brotherhood for the close-fitting breeches and tunic of the outer world, that had seemed so glamorous and now proved so itchy. "Yes," he replied courteously, for he knew the first rule of universal behavior. "I've been a brother." "Now why would a good-looking young fellow like you want to join a Brotherhood?" his shelf companion wanted to know. "Trouble over a female?" Michael shook his head, smiling. "No, I've been a member of the Angelino Brotherhood since I was an infant. My father brought me when he entered." The other man clucked sympathetically. No doubt he was grieved over the death of your mother. Michael closed his eyes to shut out the sight of a baby protruding its fat face at him three-dimensionally, but he could not shut out its lisping voice. Does your child refuse its food, grow wizened like a monkey? It'll grow plump with oh-so-good mealy mush from Nunky. No, sir, Michael replied. Father said that was one of the few blessings that brightened an otherwise benighted life. Horror contorted his fellow traveler's plump features. Be careful, young man, he warned. Lucky for you that you are talking to someone as broad-minded as I, but others aren't. You might be reported for violating a taboo. An earth taboo, moreover. An earth taboo? Certainly. Motherhood is sacred here on Earth, and so, of course, in the entire United Universe. You should have known that. Michael blushed. He should indeed. For a year prior to his leaving the lodge, he had carefully studied the customs and taboos of the universe so that he should be able to enter the new life he'd planned for himself, with confidence and ease. Under the system of universal kinship, all the customs and all the taboos of all the planets were the law on all the other planets. For the wise ones had decided many years before that wars arose from not understanding one's fellows, not sympathizing with them. If every nation, every planet, every solar system had the same laws, customs, and habits, they reasoned, there would be no differences, and hence no wars. Future events had proved them to be correct. For 500 years there had been no war in the United Universe, and there was peace and plenty for all. Only one crime was recognized throughout the solar systems, injuring a fellow creature by word or deed, and the telepaths of Aldebaran were still trying to add thought to the statute. Why, then, Michael had questioned the Father Superior, was there any reason for the lodge's existence? Any reason for a group of humans to retire from the world and live in the simple ways of their primitive forefathers? When there had been war, injustice, tyranny, there had perhaps been an understandable emotional reason for fleeing the world. But now why refuse to face a desirable reality? Why turn one's face upon the present and deliberately go back to the life of the past? The high collars, vests, and trousers, the inefficient coal furnaces, the rude gasoline tractors of medieval days. The Father Superior had smiled. You are not yet a fully fledged brother, Michael. You cannot enter your novitiate until you've achieved your majority, and you won't be 30 for another 5 years. Why don't you spend some time outside and see how you like it? Michael had agreed, but before leaving he had spent months studying the ways of the United Universe. He had skimmed over Earth because he had been so sure he'd know its ways instinctively. Remembering his preparations, he was astonished by his smug self-confidence. A large scarlet pencil jumped merrily across the ad video screen. The face on the eraser opened its mouth and sang, Our pencils are finest from point up to rubber, for the lead is from yed, while the wood comes from Deshubba. Is there any way of turning that thing off? Michael wanted to know. The other man smiled. If there were, my boy, do you think anybody would watch it? Furthermore, turning it off would violate the spirit of free enterprise. We wouldn't want that, would we? Oh, no, Michael agreed hastily. Certainly not. And it might hurt the advertiser's feelings, cause him ego injury. How could I ever have had such a ridiculous idea? Michael murmured, abashed. Allow me to introduce myself, said his companion. My name is Pierce B. Carpenter. Aphrodisiacs are my line. Here's my card. He handed Michael a transparent tab with a photograph of Mr. Carpenter suspended inside, together with his registration number, his name, his address, and the universal seal of approval. Clearly, he was a character of the utmost respectability. My name's Michael Frey, the young man responded, smiling awkwardly. I'm afraid I don't have any cards. Well, you wouldn't have had any use for them where you were. Now look here, son, Carpenter went on in a lowered voice. I know you've just come from the lodge, and the mistakes you'll make will be through ignorance rather than deliberate malice. But the police wouldn't understand. You know what the sacred writings say. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. I'd be glad to give you any little tips I can. For instance, your hands. Michael spread his hands out in front of him. They were perfectly good hands, he thought. Is there something wrong with them? Carpenter blushed and looked away. Didn't you know that on Electra it is forbidden for anyone to appear in public with his hands bare? Of course I know that, Michael said impatiently. But what's that got to do with me? The salesman was wide-eyed. But if it is forbidden on Electra, it becomes automatically prohibited here. But Electrons have 8 fingers on each hand, Michael protested, with 2 fingernails on each, all covered with green scales. Carpenter drew himself up as far as it was possible to do while lying down. Do 8 fingers make one a lesser universal? Of course not, but is he inferior to you then because he has 16 fingernails? Certainly not, but would you like to be called guilty of? Carpenter paused before the dreaded word. Intolerance? No, 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 Michael almost shrieked. It would be horrible for him to be arrested before he even had time to view Port York. I've lots of gloves in my pack, he babbled. Lots and lots. I'll put some on right away. With nervous haste, he pressed the lever which dropped his pack down from the storage compartment. It landed on his stomach. The device had been invented by one of the Teshubans who are, as everyone knows, hoop-shaped. Michael pressed the button marked Gloves A, and a pair of yellow gauntlets slid out. Carpenter pressed his hands to his eyes. Yellow is the color of death on Saturn, and you know how morbid the Saturnians are about passing away. No one ever wears yellow. Sorry, Michael said humbly. The button marked Gloves B yielded a pair of rose-colored gloves which harmonized ill with his scarlet tunic and turquoise breeches, but he was past caring for aesthetic effects. The quality's high, sang a quartet of beautiful female humanoids, but the price is meager. You know when you buy plummy fruitcake from Vega. The salesman patted Michael's shoulder. You staying a while in Port York? Michael nodded. Then you'd better stick close to me for a while until you learn our ways. You can't run around loose by yourself until you've acquired civilized behavior patterns, or you'll get into trouble. Thank you, sir, Michael said gratefully. It's very kind of you. He twisted himself around. It was boiling hot inside the jet bus, and his damp clothes were clinging uncomfortably, and struck his head against the bottom of the shelf above. Awfully inconvenient arrangement here, he commented. Wonder why they don't have seats. Because this arrangement, Carpenter said stiffly, is the one that has proven suitable for the greatest number of intelligent life forms. Oh, I see, Michael murmured. I didn't get a look at the other passengers. Are there many extraterrestrials on the bus? Dozens of them. Haven't you heard the Syrians singing? A low moaning noise had been pervading the bus, but Michael had thought it arose from defective jets. Oh, yes, he agreed, and very beautiful it is, too, but so sad. Syrians are always sad, the salesman told him. Listen. Michael strained his ears past the racket of the ad video. Sure enough, he could make out words. Our wings were unfurled in a far distant world. Our bodies are pain-racked, delirious. And never, it seems, will we see, save in dreams, the bright purple swamps of our Sirius. Carpenter brushed away a tear. Poignant, isn't it? Very, very touching, Michael agreed. Are they sick or something? Oh, no. They wouldn't have been permitted on the bus if they were. They're just homesick. Syrians love being homesick. That's why they leave Sirius in such great numbers. Fasten your suction discs, please, the stewardess, a pretty two-headed Danubian, ordered as she walked up and down the gangway. We're coming into Port York. I have an announcement to make to all passengers on behalf of the United Universe. Zosma was admitted into the Union early this morning. All the passengers cheered. Since it is considered immodest on Zosma, she continued, ever to appear with the heads bare, henceforward it will be taboo to be seen in public without some sort of head covering. Wild, scrabbling sounds indicated that all the passengers were searching their packs for headgear. Michael unearthed a violet cap. The salesman unfolded what looked like a medieval opera hat in piercingly bright green. Always got to keep on your toes, he whispered to the younger man. The universe is expanding every minute. The bus settled softly on the landing field and the passengers flew, floated, crawled, undulated, or walked out. Michael looked around him curiously. The lodge had contained no extraterrestrials. For such as those as sought seclusion had brotherhoods on their own planets. Of course, even in Angeles he had seen other worlders, humanoids from Vega, scaly electrons, the wispy, ubiquitous Syrians, but nothing to compare with the crowds that surged here. Scarlet Meropians rubbed tentacles with bulging-eyed Talithans. Lumpish gray Jovians plodded along graceful, spidery Nunkians. And there were countless others whom he had seen pictured in books, but never before in reality. The gaily colored costumes and bodies of those beings rendered kaleidoscopic a field already brilliant with red and green lights and banners. The effect was enhanced by Mr. Carpenter, whose emerald green cloak was drawn back to reveal a chartreuse tunic and olive green breeches, which had apparently been designed for a taller and somewhat less pudgy man. Carpenter rubbed modestly gloved hands together. I've no immediate business, so supposing I start showing you the sights. What would you like to see first, Mr. Frey? Or would you prefer a nice, restful move-in? Frankly, Michael admitted, the first thing I'd like to do is get myself something to eat. I didn't have any breakfast, and I'm famished. Two small creatures standing close to him giggled nervously and scuttled off on 6 legs apiece. Shh, not so loud. There are females present. Carpenter drew the youth to a secluded corner. Don't you know that on Themen it's frightfully vulgar to so much as speak of eating in public? But why? Michael demanded in too loud a voice. What's wrong with eating in public here on Earth? Carpenter clapped a hand over the young man's mouth. Hush, he cautioned. After all, on Earth there are things we don't do or even mention in public, aren't there? Well, yes, but those are different. Not at all. Those rules might seem just as ridiculous to a Themimian, but the Themimians have accepted our customs just as we've accepted the Themimians. How would you like if a Themimian violated one of our taboos in public? You must consider the feelings of the Themimians as equal to your own. Observe the golden rule. Do unto extraterrestrials as you would be done by. But I'm still hungry, Michael persisted, modulating his voice, however, to a decent whisper. Do the proprieties demand that I starve to death, or can I get something to eat somewhere? Naturally, the salesman whispered back. Port York provides for all bodily needs. Numerous feeding stations are conveniently located throughout the port, and there must be some on the field. After gazing furtively over his shoulder to see that no females were watching, Carpenter approached a large map of the landing field and pressed a button. A tiny red light winked demurely for an instant. That's the nearest one, Carpenter explained. Inside a small, white, functional-looking building unobtrusively marked Feeding Station, Carpenter showed Michael where to insert a 2-credit piece in a slot. A door slid back and admitted Michael into a tiny, austere room, furnished only with a table, a chair, a food compartment, and an ad video. The food consisted of tabloid synthetics and was tasteless. Michael knew that only primitive creatures waste time and energy in growing and preparing natural foods. It was all a matter of getting used to this stuff, he thought glumly, as he tried to chew food that was meant to be gulped. A ferret-eyed Yedin appeared on the ad video. Do you suffer from gastric disorders? Does your viscera get in your hair? A horrid condition, but swift abolition is yours with albrum from Altair. Michael finished his meal in 15 minutes and left the compartment to find Carpenter awaiting him in the lobby, impatiently glancing at the luminous time dial embedded in his wrist. Let's go to the old town, he suggested to Michael. It will be of great interest to a student and a newcomer like yourself. A few yards away from the feeding station, the travel agents were lined up in rows, each outside his spaceship, each shouting the advantage of the tour he offered. Better than a mustard plaster is a weekend spent on Castor. If you want to show you like her, take her for a week to Spiker. Move it, stars, go to Mars. Carpenter smiled politely at them. No space trips for us today, gentlemen. We're staying on Terra. He guided the bewildered young man through the crowds and to the gates of the field. Outside, a number of surface vehicles were lined up with the drivers loudly competing for business. Come, take a ride in my rocket car, suited to both gent and lady, lined with luxury hucka fur brought from afar, and perfumed with rare scents from Algety. Whatever move-id film you choose to view will be yours in my fine cab from Mazar. Just press a button. It won't cost you nothin'. See a passionate drama of long-vanished Moo, or the bloodhounds pursuing Eliza. All honor to be laid at the feet of free trade, but whatever your race or your birth, each passenger curls up with 2 dancing girls who rides in the taxi from Earth. Couldn't we walk? At least part of the way? Michael faltered. Carpenter stared. Walk? Don't you know it's forbidden to walk more than 200 yards in any one direction? Fomalhautians never walk. But they have no feet. That has nothing whatsoever to do with it. Carpenter gently urged the young man into the Algetian cab, which reeked. Michael held his nose, but his mentor shook his head. No. TPU number 5 is the most esteemed aroma on Algety. It would break the driver's heart if he thought you didn't like it. You wouldn't want to be had up for ego-injury, would you? Of course not, Michael whispered weakly. Brunettes are darker, and blondes are fairer, the ad video informed him, when they wash out their hair with shampoos made on Chera. After a time, Michael got more or less used to TPU number 5 and was able to take some interest in the passing landscape. Port York, the biggest spaceport in the United Universe, was, of course, the most cosmopolitan city. Cosmopolitan in its architecture as well as its inhabitants. Silver domes of Earth were crowded next to the tall helical edifices of the Venusians. You'll notice that the current medieval revival has even reached architecture, Carpenter pointed out. See those period houses in the Frank Lloyd Wright and Inigo Jones manner? Very quaint, Michael commented. Great floating red and green balls lit the streets, even though it was still daylight, and long scarlet and emerald streamers whipped out from the most unlikely places. As Michael opened his mouth to inquire about this, "We now interrupt the commercials," the ad video said, "to bring you a brand new version of one of the medieval ballads that are becoming so popular." "I shall scream," stated Carpenter, "if they play Beautiful Blue Danube just once more. No, thank the wise ones, I've never heard this before." Thuban, I've been thinking," sang a buxom Beetlejuicean. "What a cosmos this could be if land masses were transported to replace the wasteful sea. I guess the first thing for me to do, Michael began in a businesslike manner, is to get myself a room at a hotel. What have I said now? The word hotel, Carpenter explained through pursed lips, is not used in polite society anymore. It has come to have unpleasant connotations. It means a place of dancing girls. I hardly think. Certainly not, Michael agreed austerely. I merely want a lodging. That word is also, well, you see, Carpenter told him. On Zania, it is unthinkable to go anywhere without one's family. They're a sort of ant, aren't they? The Zanians, I mean? More like bees. So those creatures who travel, Carpenter lowered his voice modestly, alone, hire a family for the duration of their stay. There are a number of families available, but the better types come rather high. There's been talk of reviving the old-fashioned price controls, but the wise ones say this would limit free enterprise as much as, if you'll excuse my use of the expression, tariffs would. The taxi let them off at a square meadow which was filled with transparent plastic domes housing clocks of all varieties, most of the antique type based on the old 24-hour day instead of the standard 30 hours. There were few extraterrestrial clocks, because most non-humans had time sense, Michael knew, and needed no mechanical devices. This, said Carpenter, is Times Square. Once, it wasn't really a square, but it is contrary to Nicarian custom to do, say, imply, or permit the existence of anything that isn't true. So when Neckar entered the Union, we had to square off the place. And, of course, install the clocks. Finest clock museum in the Union, I understand. The pictures in my history books, Michael began. Did I hear you correctly, sir? The capes of a bright blue cloak trembled with the indignation of a scarlet, many-tentacled being. Did you use the word history? He pronounced it in terms of loathing. I have been grossly insulted, and I shall be forced to report you to the police, sir. Please don't, Carpenter begged. This youth has just come from one of the brotherhoods and is not yet accustomed to the ways of our universe. I know that, because of the great sophistication for which your race is noted, you will overlook this little gaucherie on his part. Well, the Red One conceded, let it not be said that Meropians are not tolerant. But be careful, young man, he warned Michael. There are other beings less sophisticated than we. Guard your tongue, or you might find yourself in trouble. He indicated the stalwart constable who, splendid in gold helmet and gold-spangled pink tights, surveyed the terrain haughtily from his floating platform in the air. I should have told you, Carpenter reproached himself as the Meropian swirled off. Never mention the word history in front of a Meropian. They rose from barbarism in one generation, and so they haven't any history at all. Naturally, they're sensitive in the extreme about it. Naturally, Michael said. Tell me, Mr. Carter, is there some special reason for everything being decorated in red and green? I noticed it along the way, and it's all over here, too. Why, Christmas is coming, my boy, Carpenter answered, surprised. It's July already. About time they got started fixing things up. Some places are so slack, they haven't even got their Mother's Week shrines cleared away. A bevy of tiny, golden-haired winged creatures circled slowly over Times Square. Izarians, Carpenter explained. They're much in demand for Christmas displays. The small mouths opened, and clear soprano voices filled the air. It came upon the midnight clear, that glorious song of old, from angels bending near the earth to tune their harps of gold. Peace on earth, goodwill to men, from heavens all celestial. Peace to the universe as well, and every extraterrestrial. Beat the drum and clash the cymbals, Buy your Christmas gifts at Nimble's. This beautiful walk you see before you, Carpenter said, waving an expository arm, shaded by boogle trees from Deshubba, is called Broadway. To your left, you will be delighted to see, listen, could we, Michael began, 42nd Street, which is now actually the 42nd. By the way, it is extremely rude and hence illegal, Carpenter glared, to interrupt anyone who is speaking. But I would like, Michael whispered very earnestly, to get washed, if I might. The other man frowned. Let me see. I believe one of the old landmarks was converted into a lavatory. Only thing of suitable dimensions. Anyhow, it was absolutely useless for any other purpose. We have to take a taxi there. It's more than 200 yards. Custom, you know. A taxi? Isn't there one closer? Impatient youth. There aren't too many altogether. The installations are extremely expensive. They hailed the nearest taxi, which happened to be one of the variety equipped with dancing girls. Fortunately, the ride was brief. Michael gazed at the Empire State Building with interest. It was in a remarkable state of preservation and looked just like the pictures in his books, except that none of them showed the huge golden sign, Public Washport, riding on its spire. Attendants directed traffic from a large circular desk in the lobby. Mercurians, 78th floor. A group vegans, 14th floor right. B group, 14th floor left. C group, 15th floor right. D group, 15th floor left. Syrians, 49th floor. Female humans, 50th floor right. Males, 50th floor left. Uranians, basement. Carpenter and Michael shared an elevator with a group of sad-eyed, translucent Syrians who were singing, as usual, and accompanying themselves on wemps, a cross between a harp and a flute. Foreign planets are strange and we're subject to mange. Foreign atmospheres prove deleterious. Only with our mind's eye can we sail through the sky to the bright purple swamps of our Sirius. The cost of the compartment was half that of the feeding station. 1 credit in the slot unlocked the door. There was an ad video here, too. Friend, do you clean yourself each day? Now, let's not be evasive, for each one has his favored way. Some use an abrasive, and some use oil. Some shed their skins in a brand new hide emerging. Some rub with grease put up in tins. For others, there's deterging. Some lick themselves to take off grime. Some beat it off with rope. Some cook it away in boiling lime. Old-fashioned ones use soap. More ways there are than I recall, and each of these will differ. But the only one that works for all is OmniClean from Kiffa. And now, smiled Carpenter as the two humans left the building, we must see you registered for a nice family. Nothing too ostentatious, but on the other hand, you mustn't count credits and ally yourself beneath your station. Michael gazed pensively at 2 slender, snake-like diphthons, writhing only 99 shopping days till Christmas, across an aquamarine sky. They won't be permanent, he asked. The family, I mean? Certainly not. You merely hire them for whatever length of time you choose. But why are you so anxious? The young man blushed. Well, I'm thinking of having a family of my own someday. Pretty soon, as a matter of fact. Carpenter beamed. That's nice. You're being adopted. I do hope it's an Earth family that's chosen you. It's so awkward being adopted by extraterrestrials. Oh, no. I'm planning to have my own. That is, I've got a girl, you see, and I thought after I'd secured employment of some kind in Port York, I'd send for her, and we'd get married and... Married? Carpenter was now completely shocked. You mustn't use that word. Don't you know that marriage was outlawed years ago? Exclusive possession of a member of the opposite sex is slavery on Talitha. Furthermore, supposing somebody else saw your, friend and wanted her also, you wouldn't wish him to endure the frustration of not having her, would you? Michael squared his jaw. You bet I would. Carpenter drew himself away slightly, as if to avoid contamination. This is ununiversal. Young man, if I didn't have a kind heart, I would report you. Michael was too preoccupied to be disturbed by this threat. You mean if I bring my girl here, I'd have to share her? Certainly, and she'd have to share you, if someone wanted you, that is. Then I'm not staying here, Michael declared firmly, ashamed to admit even to himself how much relief his decision was bringing him. I don't think I like it anyhow. I'm going back to the Brotherhood. There was a short, cold silence. You know, son, Carpenter finally said, I think you might be right. I don't want to hurt your feelings. You promise I won't hurt your feelings? He asked anxiously, afraid Michael realized that he might call a policeman for ego injury. You won't hurt my feelings, Mr. Carpenter. Well, I believe that there are certain individuals who just cannot adapt themselves to civilized behavior patterns. It's much better for them to belong to a brotherhood such as yours than to be placed in one of the government incarceratoriums, comfortable and commodious though they are. Much better, Michael agreed. By the way, Carpenter went on, I realize that this is just vulgar curiosity on my part, and you have a right to refuse an answer without fear of hurting my feelings. But how do you happen to have a girl when you belong to a brotherhood? Michael laughed. Oh, brotherhood is merely a generic term. Both sexes are represented in our society. On Talitha, Carpenter began. I know, Michael interrupted him, like the crude primitive he was and would always be. But our females don't mind being generic. A group of Syrians was traveling on the shelf above him on the slow, very slow jet bus that was flying Michael back to Angeles, back to the lodge, back to the Brotherhood, back to her. Their melancholy howling was getting on his nerves, but in a little while, he told himself, it would all be over. He would be back home, safe with his own kind. When our minds have grown tired, when our lives have expired, when our sorrows no longer can weary us, let our ashes return, neatly packed in an urn, to the bright purple swamps of our Syria. The ad video crackled. The gown her fairy godmother once gave to Cinderella was created by the haute couture of fashion-wise Capella. The ancient taxi was there, the one that Michael had taken from the lodge early that morning to the little Angelino landing field, as if it had been waiting for his return. I see you're back, son, the driver said without surprise. He set the noisy old rockets blasting. I've been to Port York once. It's not a bad place to live in, but I hate to visit it. I'm back. Michael sank into the moth-eaten sable cushions and gazed with pleasure at the familiar landmarks half seen in the darkness. I'm back. And a loud sneer to civilization. Better be careful, son, the driver warned. I know this is a rural area, but civilization is spreading. There are secret police all over. How do you know I ain't a government spy? I could pull you in for insulting civilization. The elderly black and white ad video flickered, broke into purring sound. Do you find life continues to daze you? Do you find for a quick death you hanker? Why not try the new style euthanasia, performed by a skilled workman from Anka? Not anymore, Michael thought contentedly. He was going home. End of Tea Tray in the Sky by Evelyn E. Smith. Read by Paul Hampton. Tubemonkey by Jerome Bixby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tubemonkey by Jerome Bixby. Radiations had shorted his brilliant pilot's brain, left him an aimless, childish hulk. Yet Rhiannon had his moments when he needed them. Echoed by the sloping, sun-drenched concrete walls booming above the high, bony clatter of monorail cranes, shaming the entire fuming metallic hub of Boat Bed 52, the sound might have been the cavernous indignation of some giant beast being dragged zooward from a Bio-Institute boat. It was, however, a voice singing. Oh, the boats come in and the boats go out, and we clean 'em and screen 'em and preen 'em. We fix their fins and we polish their snouts, with a 5-second breather between 'em. If she comes in smash from a steer rocket lash, do we wait till they've counted the dead? Oh, never, tut-tut, we just plate up her butt, and fix up the rest in the... Mountainous Rhiannon couldn't remember the last word. The clouded crystal, that was Rhiannon. He killed his buffing ray and aimed a bellow that not only shivered the eardrums of its target, but woke up Sergeant Adams 100 feet below, bringing him to his feet with an adoring bark. Hey, Stevie, what's the last word? Steve Podolsky swung his legs into view and slid carelessly down the dull metal roundness of Tube 14. Like a boy on a barrel. His magnetic boots thunked onto Tube 13 and took hold. He gave Rhiannon a look compounded of acid and pity. Go to hell with your noise. Off at the other end of Bed 52, a gong sounded its invitation to cease work and relax for a while. The 12 Navy space boats in 52, lined hip to hip like reclining madames on their slanting cradles, seemed suddenly to begin to shed their skins as a solid parasitica of outship workers melted in streams toward the upthrust frameworks of the lifts. "I coming gout!" A small, cabbage-like asteroidal came out of the smudgy darkness of the tube, a scraping ray in each flat tentacle. "I knockin' goff!" Without a break in its fluid motion, it climbed onto Rhiannon's arm and couched itself in the angle of his elbow. Yeah, me too. Comin', Stevie? Podolsky shook his head. He stood and watched Rhiannon and Tweety, Tui was its given name, but to pronounce it correctly always sounded a bit gay, make their way toward the lift. He shook his head again. Once a pilot, he thought. Not necessarily always a pilot. Space did rotten things to men who got careless with their radiation screens. It blotched their minds, tossed up fences around memory and intelligence. A most brilliant crystal. That's what Rhiannon had once been. 60 feet away, and 4 stories above the concrete floor of Bed 52, a man stood by the curving window of Karen's office and watched Rhiannon descend in the lift. He was a small, padded man with a sly look of the lower Mars suburbs about him. Tubemonkey, he said, curling his lips over the word. Karen raised his sober businessman's eyes from their inspection of the briefcase on the desk before him. He'll do perfectly, Lynn. He's just idiot enough to get us there and back, and then forget all about it. He got a dose of cosmics. Sometimes he can't even remember his own name. Yes? Lynn Janis's cold gaze followed Rhiannon as the big man went through the distant playground gate. Rhiannon was carrying Tweety on his shoulder and bouncing every other step into the air, and Tweety had wrapped indignant tentacles around his steed's head. A mud-colored puppy went scooting after them, yanked by jealousy from the quilted lay his master had prepared for him beneath Cradle 9. Can he still handle a boat? Not for combat. Karen leaned far back in his chair and locked his hands behind his head with a dignity that made the awkward position seem very right. He can still hit space, though. Janice turned away from the window. You'd better make certain that he forgets, he said. Karen shrugged. Another killing wouldn't matter much. Why do we need a pilot in the first place? You took me out last time, Janice said flatly, and I damn near died of fright. He tapped the briefcase. You're sure this is the right stuff? I can't tell from looking, you know. Hyperatomics are out of my line. Karen smiled slightly and brought his body forward in the chair. You're getting what you're paying me for. He took his time about lighting a cigarette, and then laid it on the edge of the desk as he stood up. He took a leather folder from the briefcase, opened it to reveal a dozen closely printed and diagrammed sheets. These, he said, are Larn's defenses. Take my word for it. Unlike most wars, this one had started formally and in good military taste. From their headquarters on Larn's moon, the rebels had made their request for political autonomy, and denial had come promptly, through Larn's council, from the far-off Earth Federation. The rebels had announced their intent to revolt in force, and the first engagement had occurred that very day. A space battle, fought competently by both sides, and a draw. Larn, Earth's first extrasolar pioneer world, threw up hyperatomic shields. Larn's moon did likewise, and the matter rested there in a checkmate of technological perfection. Subsequent space battles had been fought, but these mattered very little. It had boiled down to a secret service war, a deadlock to be broken by the first side skillful enough to spy out the plans of the enemy's defense setup. Sabotage could then finish the job. The attendant looked at Rhiannon without enthusiasm. He gave the big man a time ticket and turned and went through an arched doorway. He had just pulled a fresh punching bag from the dwindling supply when a wham sound ran across the air of the playground outside. Surrounded by pained chuckles, Rhiannon looked unhappily at the dangling plastic ruin and allowed himself to be shoved aside by the bitter attendant. Then, when the damage was repaired, he drew back his huge right arm again. The attendant grabbed it. Hold on, Rhiannon. There's a rocket game over here, fella. Come on, and I'll show it to you. He pulled the reluctant giant over to a facsimile control board set against the wall, watched for and saw the huge smile break out. Every day was a new life for Rhiannon, and the presence of this mock control board, installed to keep him out of trouble, always came as a wonderful surprise. Sit down, Rhiannon. Tube set? A tense nod. Gravity okay? Green light from Central? Blast off. Rhiannon zoomed his boat into outer space and began to chase a comet. It got away from him. After a while, he thought it would be nice if he could blast the whole rebel navy out of the void, and they appeared, tier upon tier of them, in gleaming battle shields. Sergeant Adams, he rumbled, make ready to fire. Adams rose up on his hind legs, compelled and controlled by the strange and inexplicable telepathic aftermath of Rhiannon's misfortune. The former pilot's cosmic brain cut, and the brain cuts of the other few similar radiation cases, had resulted in this sour blessing, had stepped up their mental broadcasting apparatus and left them very little to broadcast. Humans could often pick up random thoughts from these men, while animals reacted easily to their will. Thus it was that Sergeant Adams placed his paws on the dummy firing button, a temporarily selfless extension of Rhiannon's physical and psychical form. Together, they wiped out the rebel fleet in a matter of seconds. Rhiannon was exploring Polaris when a hand fell lightly upon his shoulder. He whirled up and around, snarling. A rebel spy on his boat? He'd kill the son. Karen ducked. his face seeming to sag pallid from the front of his skull. "Whoa now, Rhiannon, it's Karen! It's Karen!" "Rebel spy!" Rhiannon had Karen dangling off the floor at the end of his arm. He drew back his other fist, all the way to Polaris, for the blow that would end the war. Then reality registered behind those glazed, distant-seeing pupils. "Mr. Karen, I'm sorry, sir." He set his employer's sandals back on the floor and began to shuffle uncomfortably. Karen looked about him, his fury artfully concealed beneath a rigid, "we must be patient" smirk. The other workers in the ground, some of them poised in mid-step after having started to the rescue, were looking embarrassed and quickly turned to resume their games. The sounds of bowling and fencing and tennis and swimming drove away the silence, and the odd patois of multi-specied mechanics and technicians swelled up like jungle chatter. Karen put his hand on Rhiannon's sleeve and walked the big man into the vast quiet of Bed 52. Adams came after them, wagging almost everything but his head, which arrowed straight and true after the giant figure. When he was paid no attention, however, he sulked over to his box and lay down and was immediately asleep. Sergeant Adams would have been a poor choice to stand guard duty. He had been known to sleep the clock around, silent and unmoving. Great boats had been lifted from the cradles above him and others put into their place, and Adams had dreamed on and on and on. Rhiannon started to apologize again. "That's perfectly all right, soldier," Karen said smoothly. "Commendable attitude." He led the way past the cradles toward the rear of the bed. "You want to help win the war, don't you?" Yes, Rhiannon groaned. Karen beamed his approval. "Well, now, you may be able to do just that, my boy. How would you like to be—" "I was exploring Polaris, sir." Rhiannon's tones were suddenly vacant. "The people there got 3 ahead," and the latter part of the word remained unspoken, forgotten. Karen's smile wavered. They had halted by a freight entrance opening onto the green-carpeted rear grounds. He drew the big man closer to him and snapped his words like a whip. "Now listen, Rhiannon. How would you like to hit space again? To get your silver sun back? To be reinstated as a commander?" That tore through Rhiannon's fog, and he reacted. He straightened to 79 inches into the position of attention. "I'd like nothing better, sir," he said. Karen made a great show of inspecting their immediate surroundings for eavesdroppers. He said, "This is a very important, a top-secret mission. We, the Council, believe that you are the only man who can fly it. We selected you from among thousands, Rhiannon." Rhiannon stood ever more stiffly, his face incandescent. "Yes, sir. I didn't know you were a council member, sir." "Very few people do," Karen replied dryly. "Now, soldier, a special boat is being tuned up at my private field. Do you know where that is?" "Outside and back, sir. I've worked on your boats." Karen nodded. "Then go there immediately and wait. Talk to no one. I have to confer with President Nero before—" "President Nero, sir!" Karen saluted theatrically, and Rhiannon responded with eyes afire. The big man executed a neat about-face and marched 1-2 through the door. And looking after the broad back, Karen speculated where to place the death shot when the time came. The nebula hung to starboard, seeming almost at arm's length from the ports, a silver pinwheel, a 30,000 light-year toy. Rhiannon jockeyed the boat closer and closer to the rebel craft, his big hands skipping over the board with consummate, unthinking skill. He shot out the handline, and it snaked to the airlock of the other boat. Janice, holding the briefcase flat against his belly, stepped into the lower portions of the single spacesuit and ducked up and under into the top portion that hung from its rack. The muffled clicks as he turned the ceiling handles were the only sound in the cabin. Then his voice came metallic from the speaker. We'll contact you, Karen, if we need you again. Although I think this trip should be the last one." He inflated the suit and stamped several times, testing the suit's perfection by the ringing in his ears. Karen's reply was purposefully vague, with an eye to Rhiannon. "There should be use for the security chief of Federation space lines, even after the war is over, Janice. Rebel Underground will likely start up, and as you've already seen, a man with a briefcase will hardly doubt the purity of my kitchens or suspect one of my cabin boys of unwanted partisanship. I have some very cooperative men working for me." Putting a boot on the hatch ladder, Janice showed a sardonic grin through his faceplate. "Every man's purse is a traitor." Karen sliced off the words with a quick gesture and shot a look at Rhiannon. The Tubemonkey was staring through the front port at the stars, his face a caricature of bliss. Janice shrugged, saying, "I thought you said he was Nick," and swung himself clumsily up the ladder. "Besides," he added, "weren't you going to convince him of the necessity for silence?" He disappeared into the airlock. There was an airy "foot" sound as he let himself into the void. Karen walked over to the front port and watched for Janice to become visible on the near length of the line. Watched, too, Rhiannon's reflection in the glass. The big man was gaping at the nebula and twitching the thick muscles of his neck in ecstasy. Karen felt an urge to snicker. "Good to get back, eh?" he asked. Rhiannon pointed. "There's your friend, sir." Janice was bobbing hand over hand toward the unmarked rebel boat. His faceplate gleamed once as it caught the fire of the nebula. Then, before Karen's paling face, the silver cigar that was the other boat suddenly threw off into space a thin leafing of curved, misshapen plates. It grew whiskers that were ray guns, and the Nova sign of the patrol blinked into being on its nose. The transformation took just 3 seconds, and on the tick of the 4th there was a honk from Karen's teleaudio to announce that the revealed law boat desired contact. Hissing between his clamped teeth, Karen leaned over Rhiannon's wide shoulder and speared a finger at the control board. The patrolman had made the mistake of judging his boat at its space yacht face value, but it was far more than that. The yacht's concealed atomic cannons blasted the other craft into radioactive dust. The frantically gesticulating figure of Janice was swallowed by the glare, and when space darkened again, there was only the fused cable end, chewed off short near Karen's porthole. "Geez," cried Rhiannon. "Why'd you do that?" "Didn't you see?" Karen snapped. "It was a rebel boat. Janice must have been a spy." "But there was a patrol nova on—" "Rhiannon, you've done a magnificent job." Karen clapped a hand on the giant's arm and tightened it emotionally. He slipped the safety on his pocketed atom pistol with the other hand. "That wasn't a nova. That was the rebel Tetra." Rhiannon looked up at him, his forehead plowed over with thought. Then gradually a wide grin spread his lips. "We done it, didn't we?" "We sure did." Karen's face was flattened at the cheeks. How the patrol had known of this meeting he would never know, short of torturing each of his cooperative men. Janice was gone. The briefcase was gone. The real rebel boat was probably bright drifting dust somewhere between here and Larn's moon. Karen shivered. Would the patrol have his office covered? Had they known whom they were trapping? Or had the tip-off not mentioned names? One way to find out. Rhiannon looked up vaguely. "What, sir?" "Get us back to Larn, Rhiannon. I've got to report this to the president." The swirling salt of the nebula moved out of the port and vanished as the big man tailed the boat round and sidestepped into hyperspace. Karen stood with wet hands clasped at his back. "My papers. My money. I'll get them and make a run for Rebel HQ. Surely the tip had not implicated him, or he never would have gotten off Larne in the first place. The patrol would have seen to that. They knew that so many things could go wrong out in space. Such as, he thought with grim satisfaction, what had gone wrong. The government spaceport was emptied and darkened by the evening. Steve Podolsky and his brethren had gone to their homes. Tweety had gone sailing up into the stratosphere to sleep, and the only living creature was Sergeant Adams, who lay twitching his paws in a dream chase. From the floor of bed 52, Rhiannon watched Karen labor up the motionless escalator, saw the lights flicker on, saw his employer move about shoving things into a carry case. Rhiannon's affliction may be said to have been stroboscopic in character. That is, his brain functioned with an irregular alternation of clarity and fuddle. At this moment, the lights were on in that great skull, and his brain cells were skittering about, playing with a thought. It had been a patrol boat. He had seen the Nova. It had been a patrol boat. He'd seen that Nova. He shifted uneasily in his wrappings of Tubemonkey suit and reflections. He looked up again at Karen's office. The man had moved back from the window. Only his head was visible, seeming to roll like Tweety back and forth on the broad sill as he crossed from safe to desk, desk to safe. That distant face was sculptured in pure anxiety. Karen was definitely not reporting to President Nero. He wasn't doing anything of the kind. Rhiannon put these observations one under the other, added them, and got the right answer. He had been taken. Just as his fellow workers can play incredible jokes on him, when Stevie wasn't around, and have them pan out because of his brain cut, so had spy Karen pulled a whopper. Having worked this out, the busy cells slowed down. The lights began to dim behind the giant's dulling eyes. He stood there in the darkness, having one grim determination, and not knowing quite why he had it. Karen came out of his office and grunted down the escalator, unused to the knee action of climbing and descending. His shadowy figure came across the floor, gradually giving its details. His face was red. His eyes were feathered with red. He hugged the carry case like a mourning Apache mother. "Ready?" he asked. Rhiannon blocked the door. His face came puzzledly. "I ain't going." The carry case thudded to the floor. It didn't bounce, but if it had, the appearance of Karen's atom pistol would have shaded the second thud. Rhiannon planted his legs like standards. "I ain't going to fly you anyplace," he said, "and I ain't going to let you go either. I don't know why. I can't, won't." At that moment, a door rolled open at the far end of 52, and the tall, wary shapes of patrolmen blinked through the rectangle of light into the dark pool of the bed. They made directly for the still-lighted office. Silently. Karen had to reach to do it. He reached high, standing on tiptoe, and brought the butt of his gun down on Rhiannon's head. The giant made a sound like a baffled ape and took a forward step. His outflinging legs struck the floor without sensation and buckled. The gun went up and came down twice again. Rhiannon felt a cloth-ripping pain in his head. Static crackled and slammed into his brain. It swelled louder and more penetrating, then muffled down to lengthening drum rolls. The nebula beckoned him from his straight path back to Polaris. He circled it carefully, although there wasn't any sign of danger. It wasn't a very interesting nebula. He wheeled Karen's boat once again toward Polaris and his three-headed friends. Sergeant Adams sat alertly at his side. Then suddenly, terrifyingly, the boat pulled away from under their feet and left them cold and lonely in airlessness. The sweet stars began to blink out in clusters. The celestial static dimmed down into the silence of infinite sleep. Somewhere in this dying universe came a cold and wet nose. It sniffed anxiously at his face and red-matted hair. A whine, another louder whine, and a scratch of claws on concrete. Rhiannon opened his eyes. There were walls and the concrete floor and the hovering, shadowed cradles. There was the crouching figure of Karen, seen from below and distorted, framed briefly in the door. There was a mud-colored shadow that sniffed and whined and gave its tail little hesitant twitches. Then Rhiannon's eyes blinded and closed. He found himself back in that fearful, dimming universe. The distant sparking of the spaceboat's jets, a few stars to shape the emptiness. Rhiannon's last, desperate, melting thought was, "Atoms! Atoms! We gotta catch up to that boat. Come on! We gotta get back in that boat." The scratching claws went away. The last star was lost, and the velvet blackness, without entity, was complete. Karen faded as quietly as a cat out the door and hurried into his boat, darted forward to the control cabin, and slammed down a lever. With a rumble, the ground ramp folded in and the hatch sealed itself shut. He leaned against a port and shielded his eyes from the interior glare. The noise had attracted the patrolmen. They boiled through the far door and came streaking across the field, their guns spitting tight green flame. Karen thumbed his nose at them and laughed. A moment later, the boat was clawing its way toward Larn's stratosphere. He set the spectro for the tiny moon and turned away to relax on the bunk. His yacht embodied principles developed by his own technicians, armament and locomotive potentials unknown to the patrol, and he knew that he was safe from them. He regretted, however, that the hyperspace drive was useless for such short distances, for with it he might have reached his destination in less than a second. But with it also, at such a range, came the danger of overshooting, nailing himself in the boat a mile into the ground, and so he used the regular blasts and was thankful for his advanced shields. The patrol might spot him, tail him, but that was all. Smiling, he stretched out on the bunk, reached for a book, and settled himself for the 20-hour trip. Beneath the bunk, curled in the warm darkness, Sergeant Adams had settled himself for the trip long ago, for his master's dying thought command had been an urgent and overpowering one, and this spaceboat had been pictured and pointed out as clearly from its fellows as had been the firing button among the myriad devices on the dummy control board. An obedient but sleepy Adams had entered the boat almost at Karen's heels. Unheard and unseen in the confusion of rumbling hatches and charging patrolmen, very eager to get back to his interrupted dream chase. With all his famous quiet and quiescence, he slept. After a while, Karen yawned. The cabin seemed stuffy. He looked up from his book, and his eyes happened to fall on the oxygen gauge. He felt a momentary chill. As there had been no time to recharge, it was very fortunate that there had been no need. Rhiannon wasn't coming along. "Almost empty," he breathed. "I'll barely make it." He put the book aside, turned over, and went to sleep. Hours later, when the oxy alarm clanged empty, he roused, sweat-soaked and gasping, to the realization that Rhiannon, in a manner of speaking, had come along after all. Lieutenant Dean of the rebels glanced out his office window, eyes resting puzzledly on the spaceboat that sat silently where it had been brought down by the landing field's tractor beams. He frowned, then continued writing his report. What would seem to have happened is this. Karen, with a depleted store of oxygen and unaware of the animal's presence, undertook to flee here to escape the patrol. See Report 151 and recordings of patrol broadcasts M16, 17, and 2. and in mid-passage discovered the dog, which must have somehow contrived to remain out of sight until that time. By then it was too late, for the tanks were empty and the oxygen in the body of the boat was not sufficient to last the trip. He could not turn back, and that he knew we would not risk sending a boat to pick him up is evinced by the fact that he did not call upon us to do so. I believe it likely that Karen debated killing the dog as well as himself, but decided vengefully that the animal, indirectly the cause of his destruction, should suffer the agony of asphyxiation. Therefore, he shot only himself. See enclosed microshots showing interior of boat with corpse exactly as found after boat, due to erratic behavior, was beamed onto field as a safety measure. The dog, however... Lieutenant Dean looked up and grinned at the stern-wagging Adams, working noisily over a garned steak beside the desk. The dog, being very small and somewhat addicted to inactivity, survived the trip and led us a merry chase before his final capture. I request that we be allowed to adopt him as a mascot. Dean chewed at his pencil, then laid it on the desk and clapped his hands. "Here, boy," he growled. "You've given me a crazy kind of report to write up. Come here and give us a hand. Come on, speak. What's the story?" Sergeant Adams eyed him for a moment, growled softly, and returned to the steak. End of Tubemonkey by Jerome Bixby. Read by Paul Hampton.
The Voice of Scariliop by Hans Bach. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. The Voice of Scariliop by Hans Bach. 4 pillars arising out of the stone like strange growing things of demoniac shape. These Redforth saw and comprehended, knowing full well that Tarath had always abounded in monstrosities. But what, he asked himself, will knowing of such as this be of use to me as I search for Giltharmy? For he had at last come to realize, to admit even to himself, that he was a lost thing. The Yulfog had taken his soul. They had exiled him to this lost land of dread. But they had hinted of escape, if he could find it. Si Yamlan, he had told him, pointing to a writhing belt of suns, lifting and lowering at the horizon like the yellow crest of a flaming wave. And he had nodded his head. They had vanished, disintegrating, it seemed. He didn't then know that they were related to Topper's friends, and the Jeep in one thing, that their Typonosif and Tragoifer was applicable to the atmosphere. The 4 pillars were bending from their own weight, strange colors, like an idiot's conception of a spectrum, spectrally rippled like irid waves across the columns, like music in color. Assailed by their complex harmonies, Redforth could only stand speechless, hands thrust defensively forward. It was then that he saw Irie. The pillars split. From each of them drifted a whiff of steam. They united in a wavering cloud which shimmered an instant in mid-air, then settled to the ground. And as it touched the metallic grass blades which stretched on and on like the upraised swords of a midget army, the vapor cloud condensed into a woman's body. Irie, Queen of Scariliop. He recognized her at once, though he had only read of her. She was not human. Her body was like a snake's, and she had bat wings. From a cluster of writhing worm tentacles leered her face, like a mask in the heart of a seething flower. It was oval, and the scarlet mouth was like a velvet cushion, disproportionate, waiting for some priceless burden. Her nose was negligible, but her lone eye was vast and blue, like a doorway opening upon a sky too blue to belong to our world, like blue incarnate, and blue is the color of mystery. She opened her mouth, and her tongue unrolled, uncoiled toward Redforth. 3 feet long, the tongue was filamental, like a strand of red cobweb, tipped by a touch of fluff like a dandelion seed. This member wandered lightly over Redforth's cheek, and for the first time Iry spoke. "It comes to me that here is the man for whom we have been seeking. Yazgorfitov." Her voice was soft as clouds. Redforth in vain peered to behold her companion. "Now shall we enlighten him as to the ways of escape, in return for a favor, of course." The air about her, for a fleeting instant, had turned blue. Then she nodded. She leaned forward to whisper, but suddenly there was a crackling. "The rock!" she cried. "The rock! I must return before it is too late, and I too am trapped." She writhed, became coiling wreaths of smoke, and the smoke flowed back to the rocks, hovered over it. The 4 pillars quivered and joined into one, and then, in a twinkling, had crumbled to powder. But there was an uncanny blueness in the air about Redforth, and that night he had a dreadful dream. For he had become Earthakal, and Iry had been merely the bait. End of The Voice of Scariliop by Hans Bach.